Welcome to the next installment in AlertFind's webinar series. Today we are doing Is Your Organization Hurricane Ready? 5 Actions to Take Now. We are going to be live tweeting this event on Twitter. You can follow us at alertfind.com. And if you want to contribute to the conversation, use the hashtags Hurricane Readiness and hashtag AFWebinar. Today, I am so pleased to introduce you to Joe Trainor, the Program Director for Disaster Science and Management at the University of Delaware. Joe is an experienced emergency preparedness expert who specializes in household, organizational, and community disasters and catastrophes. He has conducted extensive disaster and disaster preparedness research, working with organizations of all sizes to help them understand the threats they face and implement emergency preparedness plans. He has a Master's of Arts in Sociology and a PhD of Philosophy of Sociology, and currently serves as the Program Director for Disaster Science and Management at the University of Delaware. Joe, welcome to the webinar.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. We are so thrilled to have you here. And I am your moderator today, Danielle Ricci. I am the Senior Director of Marketing at AlertFind.
Thanks, Danielle.
So today's agenda, we're going to cover the right questions to ask when creating a hurricane preparedness plan, key steps businesses can take to protect their employees, operations, and sales, the most common mistakes businesses are making, how to balance employees' personal and work responsibilities, and how to promote personal preparedness with your critical employees. So Joe, I want to just dive in by talking about, how hard it is to get your arms around, what as an organization, what you should do to prepare for a hurricane. As companies start to prepare, it can be a really complicated process. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence and advice, but, it's not really very thoroughly researched.
Sure, Danielle. It's definitely an issue. I think that business continuity is becoming more and more important, particularly as we're seeing threats rise, especially for coastal communities. And we're seeing a lot more concern or interest in this now. Larger companies have always been involved in this, but it's not been as common for kind of mid-sized businesses and particularly for small businesses. But it's becoming more important, and it's not easy for folks. I think a lot of times what happens is people kind of work from best practices or among the people that they know in their area. People are driven by case studies or case examples. So what I mean by that is they hear of somebody who did something one time and they take that on. Or even in a lot of the writing on this, a lot of it's anecdotal, right? So it's one organization did this one thing. Maybe you might do that same thing too. So I agree with you. It's tough to get started for organizations that don't have a base or a history in this. It's hard to find some of the deeper critical information.
And so how does that lack of researched and validated best practices affect businesses when they go to create or improve preparedness plans?
Yep. So definitely the way that it affects it, there's a couple different things. A lot of this, what you mentioned, is starting from zero. So a lot of times what happens is when somebody's placed into this position, this kind of position, and they're asked to take on these kinds of responsibilities, they don't really know how to get started, and they think through ideas that other people have already thought through before, or sometimes they take on untested ideas. So what I mean by that is they kind of think through it in their office, but because they don't have a lot of resources or they're not connected to a community of people that are thinking about this, they put in place organizational level policies that are based on their individual kind of gut or intuition. And unfortunately, when you do the research and you look at what's going on, sometimes things that make sense aren't always that make sense from a logical perspective aren't always the most effective from kind of an outcomes perspective. So people don't have the information base to make those kinds of decisions. The other thing is that sometimes in organizations, because it's not often a priority when something's starting up, it's new, Um, there's a lot of instability in the approach. So maybe from event to event, there's a lot of shifts and changes, or every time somebody's hired into that position, that person, because there isn't a lot of institutional stability, they rethink the whole thing over and over. So you have a lot of change and churn, or people are trying to start up on multiple sites in a medium-sized business, and those two folks that are charged with this are not coordinating, and they're doing all kinds of different things. Or sometimes it's a go-it-alone mentality. So you put one person in charge and they say, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to think it through, and I'm going to figure out all the solutions. And they don't kind of engage or connect with all the stakeholders from within the organization or the community around the organization to think through the problem. So again, I think a lot of times that starting from zero without good base leads to people making less informed decisions than they might be able to do otherwise.
So where should organizations look for these additional resources, and how should they work with other groups to, validate that information?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that I would see, and you've got to remember, I'm a professor here at a university. I do a lot of community level work. So one of the things that I think people should start up is by realizing that the business isn't by itself only doing its own thing. There's going to be organizations in the community. There's going to be other individuals right around you that are also thinking through these kinds of problems. So for example, you might consult a local level or a county level or even a state level emergency management agency. These agencies are often pretty keen to make connections with business communities and help community businesses think about their own readiness, but also help them think about their place within the community. So how does the business contribute, kind of in a social corporate responsibility sense to what's going on in the place around them where all their employees are located. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to go to business specific types of resources. And I think things like, for example, your local chamber of commerce or your local Rotary Club or Lions Club or other kind of business entity, those groups often have resources for people that are doing emergency planning and are doing business continuity planning to get started thinking about it. In addition, there's also some professional associations for business continuity or business emergency or business risk planners. That's a good place to get connected to the group of professionals that are working in these types of issues. And again, not every business is going to be able to devote an individual or even a group of individuals to this particular problem. So you can learn from other folks that have been doing this for a while and get some sense of what they're involved in. And then I think one other thing, because maybe it's a little self-serving here, but I also think that you can partner with local universities. So we do this kind of work with local businesses. We might come and do something as simple as a talk, or something as sophisticated as a contract where you might be asked to do something. Or we have other kinds of things, like, for example, sometimes we'll run classroom exercises in a business class or a public policy class where the local business acts as the kind of a co-consultant for a classroom that help them think through a problem. So that way students get hands-on learning, but it also contributes to solving a problem that you have in a kind of low-cost way. So there's some things that you might think about.
That's a great list of resources, and it sounds like the big takeaway there is just never start from zero. Always do a bunch of research first.
Yeah.
So are there any other steps that organizations can take?
Yep. So in this case, we were talking about external review processes. One of the things that I think is also really important is, again, for businesses to think a little bit about what other businesses or other people in their industries do as well. I know it's kind of hard because across industries there might be regulatory bodies, or there might be professional associations, or there might be so to get some sense of what's going on in your industry around this type of issue is a really helpful way to get started. And I think in some ways to kind of build on experiences and maybe even get involved in helping to build connections across other organizations like your organization that are doing this. So again, businesses, there's a tendency to kind of downplay the importance of emergency planning because you're planning for something that people tend to think it may or may not ever happen. But unfortunately, as risks grow and we see more kinds of disasters, more types of hazards, more development in risky places, these things are going to be more prevalent, and they definitely need to be planned for. So again, getting people together that are tasked with this, you can force multiply. So you can help to learn from the experience of other people, and particularly if you do that in a systematic kind of way, it can lead to the development of accreditation standards. For example, there's accreditation standards for emergency management organizations at the state level for government now, or business continuity standards for what level of planning you have within your organization. Also, sometimes for bigger types of issues, you might tap into, depending on your industry, there are kind of regulatory and review boards like if you happen to be in aviation, for example, the National Transportation Safety Board has, you would already know quite a bit about that, but they do kind of debriefs on these kinds of accidents and issues. In other industries, they have similar kinds of things for chemical spills or bridge inspections if you happen to be in construction industry, or again, in higher education, we do accreditation. So again, are you delivering at a quality level based on your industry? And can you build a group of people excited about improving the way your organization or type of organization or industry actually works?
And how does this approach help you find potential flaws in your hurricane preparedness planning?
Right. So when we're looking at hurricane preparedness planning, I think that in searching for flaws or looking for flaws in your organizations, I think the external review gets you started. But I think one of the most important things for organizations to do when they're trying to find the flaws in themselves or the flaws in their processes, I think there's two kind of big things you can do. The first thing is to assess your past problems, and I think the second is to assess your current planning or preparedness. So let me start with the first one, assessing your past problems. So I think that one of the things we know about the problems that organizations faced in disasters is that oftentimes it's not new things. It's not like you might not have been able to predict it. It's that the disaster event or the hazard event itself exacerbates problems that already exist within your organization. So what do I mean by that? I mean things that are issues or concerns that were kind of sitting at the surface before the event happened turn into big problems when you put them in the right context. So there's an idea that's kind of built into building organizations that take care of these kinds of issues. It's called high reliability organizations, and a set of principles for organizations that want to avoid disaster, that want to avoid crises. So a couple of things, like for example, the first thing is to go out and look for flaws in the organizations. I think a lot of times we have a tendency to see small failures as small failures, right? So something happened and a shipment got delayed, and it just happens sometimes, right? Somebody made a mistake along the way. Organizations that are focused on high reliability operations, when they have flaws or problems, they look at them. They say, well, what created this issue? How can we avoid it? And they look at it not in a judgmental way to kind of find the problems and assign blame. They look at it to say, what's the matter with the system that allowed this to happen? So again, I think they tend to look for flaws specifically and explicitly in their operations. The second thing is there's a reluctance to simplify problems. So again, for example, in that last example, I used to work in a warehouse at one point in my life, and I was involved in an issue with a forklift, and the forklift it broke while I was running, and it ended up spilling some paint on the floor. So at the time, I was working for an organization that really cared about safety and sells paint. So I can't say who they are, but you might put it together. And that organization launched a kind of a regional look at all of their forklifts. They said, this small spill might have identified a problem in our kind of safety culture, And it turns out that they identified a number of forklifts had this particular problem where a solenoid was going bad and it made the brakes catch. And they basically avoided a whole bunch of future accidents by making an adjustment, by seeing that little accident that I had as a temporary employee working in a warehouse, not as, that guy made a mistake or, oh, we just didn't catch that one. They think of it like the tip of the iceberg, the beginning of, and then they dig down to see how far that problem might go. Another thing is, and I had my same experience with this preoccupation with failure. So the idea is when something happens and someone identifies a problem, they celebrate it. So for example, I caused, ostensibly I caused, a several $1,000 loss in paint when that thing fell. But when I identified the issue and helped them understand where it came from, and they didn't, I wasn't written up or cited or given some kind of problem or fired, because again, at the time I was only a temporary employee. They were thanking me for having found this issue that potentially saved thousands and thousands of dollars down the line in other places. So again, it's this preoccupation with finding failures and fixing them. Another thing is resilience. So the idea that you contain and address your issues. So if things come up, because you're not ignoring them, you are constantly looking for other kinds of ways to kind of keep problems from cascading across the system. So again, I think that's just one of those big takeaways. If you're going to find flaw, you've got to create an organizational culture that goes beyond one business continuity plan or finding flaws, fixing problems like a one-man Superman or one-woman Superwoman, right? You want to kind of build in a culture of looking for problems and issues and that can into your organization.
And can you give me some examples of how this plays out in the business world? And I'm thinking, in particular, even so when you're looking for flaws, I think you can look in your sort of everyday business operations, but maybe you have some ideas about how people can get in the mindset of like, okay, in a hurricane, this is the thing that it's not just paint spills, like, we could
Right.
lose lives over this. Yeah.
Sure. Yep. So if we're looking at hurricanes and we're looking at some examples of how preparedness or how issues matter, I think you don't have to go any further than saying Hurricane Katrina, right? Where you can see that thinking through problems in these more complicated, complex ways is really important. So if you look at, we'll give you one business example and I'll give you one government example. So I think if you look at, for example, Hurricane Katrina and you look at evacuation, right? So most people remember evacuation in Hurricane Katrina as like a massive failure, and it turns out it's that event was one of the largest evacuations in history. It was one of the most successful evacuations of people by car. The problem is when they planned it, when they put it together, they didn't think about the fact that there's so many people in the city that didn't have cars. So they built an entire system that had a kind of fundamental flaw in the way they thought about it. I think you could see other examples in for example, the healthcare industry, and we've seen this example actually repeat itself several times in healthcare facilities, particularly retirement communities, building their buildings in floodplains and not being prepared for the eventual need to evacuate them. So you get these horrible images of elderly people sitting in water waist deep, and because they never thought that if this hurricane comes through, I'm not going to be able to evacuate these people in time. That's a really dramatic example. Even simpler examples, though, when a business is in the area, they're not right in the coastline, but the infrastructure damage from a coastal storm brings down the power lines. Something, you take an example, for example, like Northridge earthquakes back in the mid 90s took out power to like 60% of businesses in the area, and took out about 50% of the telephone service. So if your business relies on the internet, or it relies on power, or it relies on water systems, are you prepared to deal with the lack of those things when infrastructure damage happens for a hurricane? Even if you're not in the immediate storm surge area or right on the coast, there may be things that cascade out to you because the larger systems been damaged. So I think, again, it's thinking a little bit more proactively about what your needs are inside of your business, what your concerns are, how fast you're expected to operate, what your employee turnaround time is, what your clients expect from you in terms of responsiveness in this kind of situation. So I think it's there's a lot of things to consider.
And what are the key factors organizations need to consider when they're putting together hurricane preparedness plans?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things that we can really think about for hurricanes, and you're thinking about hurricane planning or business continuity in the face of hurricanes. So the first one is you've got to think about not just the kind of short-term immediate issues, but you've got to think about it in a longer scale. So what I mean by that is I think a lot of people can envision that power loss I was just talking about, and they might be willing to kind of go out and get a generator, right? So you know, I'll replace that short-term power concern. I think that the truth is that many businesses actually don't even take those measures. They haven't done anything to get ready, right? So I think the first factor is you've got to do some things ahead of time. You've got to do some of this preparedness and planning before the events come. If you don't do that, you're starting out behind the 8 ball. All right. So the next thing, you've got to plan for loss of infrastructure. The idea that if you are in an area that's affected or impacted, you may not have power systems, you may not have telephone systems, you may not have internet systems. So what's your backup? Right? I used to work in management in like low-level management for a Home Depot at one point, and we had a power outage around not even a hurricane, but just a regular nor'easter, and the power went down for a couple hours, and we had no system in place, for example, to check people out at the registers. So the entire system was predicated on an electronic register, and there was nothing in the store to be able to kind of hand calculate costs, to pull up product costs, to write a handwritten receipt, to take credit cards through the old carbon copies process. So again, just thinking through are there ways in your particular business? Again, larger businesses sometimes aren't as nimble, but in the medium sized to small business environment, you've got to have systems in place to deal with those kinds of short-term infrastructure losses. I think also you got to think about the fact that your business itself may be affected. So it's not just how do I deliver the services? It's do I have a building that needs repair? You know, do I have some kind of damage in my building? Is there some kind of loss of infrastructure? So again, there's a number of those kinds of concerns. And then the other things I think are more long-term planning, has a lot to do with your ability to absorb short-term disruptions, you know, your slack resources. So for example, businesses often experience reduced customer flow early after events. So can your business withstand a reduction in its normal kind of capital intake, normal revenue intake, I mean. Another thing is reduced resupply. So if you're a business that relies on materials and supplies, oftentimes in the immediate aftermath, there'll be a reduced ability to get those materials and supplies. So do you have some kind of excess or slack resources available to you? Do you have an agreement in place with someone to provide, or a connection to another business somewhere else that might be able to help you with those things? And then the last thing is, if you don't have those two things and you have a reduction in can you keep your employees on? Meaning, do you have the resources to pay employees to continue working in your business until you can recover your income streams? So again, I think those are some key factors that you might consider for the storm context itself.
And what are some other key operational considerations when planning?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm gonna twist this just a little bit. I'm gonna give you a couple of kind of broad level operational things, so operational ideas things to think about in your operations. And I'm going to give you some specific activities that people can engage in their current operations to get ready for disasters. So I'll give you one example I'll give a couple examples for these broad level. The first thing is continuous improvement. I think one of the problems or one of the issues that sometimes businesses have is they take on a planning process. They create some kind of singular document, and they do that when they start the business, or maybe after a particularly bad storm season, and then they never look at it again. And there's kind of an adage in the business that no plan ever survives first contact, right? So it's not the plan itself. People don't go in, you don't go into your flooded out business and search the shelves for the book, right? It's not the plan itself that is really important. It's the process of planning. It's thinking through the problems that you might face. It's having conversations about what you're going to do. It's going through that thoughtfulness about where you are and what you need and what you might do in a number of situations that's really beneficial for people. So again, it's got to be a continuous improvement. As your business matures and changes and adjusts, so needs to your processes, right? As you change suppliers, as you change vendors, as you change the kind of business customers you have, you want to be thinking about that. The second thing is that learning. I think we talked about this before, right? So the ability to kind of take in issues or problems or concerns and integrate them into your process. I'll give you another one: engagement across the organization and outside of the organization. So I mentioned this earlier too, but it's really important. So I want to stress it, right? That you cannot be an army of one or an army of five, or you need to be connected with the everyday business operations of your employees. So again, if it's just a small shop, you got to know what's going on in your shop across the elements. If you're a mid-sized business or larger, you got to be thinking about how these things affect all the different units or all the different locations. So again, engagement across, and then you've got to be thinking about your business's place within the broader community. We've seen some really great examples in the past where businesses and business districts kind of lead the charge, because if people aren't working and they're not earning income, they're not able to afford to rebuild, replace, deal with issues. So again, business sector engagement is really important for recovery in areas. And then the other thing is prioritization. I think this is kind of every small business owner, every medium business owner knows this, that there's a million things that you could do and a million things that you're asked to do. There's only so much time to actually make those things happen. So being able to prioritize the issues or problems or concerns that are most critical to you at that particular moment. So not getting overwhelmed by the idea that there's so much to do. I might as well, I don't even know where to start. I can't do this. Thinking about this as a set of tasks that you can prioritize and kind of take in sequences is really important. Okay, so now shifting gears again with these operational considerations, some more tangible things that you can actually do. The first thing is you can attend some meetings. I know nobody wants to attend more meetings, but you can do things to kind of, again, interface with the professional community and/or the government agencies that are involved in these kinds of activities. Most emergency managers would love to meet more with business professionals. So I think if you contacted them and said, hey, we're interested in this, there's oftentimes people that are devoted just to preparedness in the community, and business preparedness is part of that. The next thing is to talk to your employees. So I think this sounds silly to people, but a lot of times people have never talked to their employees about what they expect from them, what they would think they would do, what would happen, and they sometimes get surprised when events happen because there's a disconnect between what they think and what their employees think. Another thing to do is to look at your insurance. So again, if you have business insurance, and if you don't, you should think about it, particularly if you're in risky areas. It's actually a big push within FEMA right now to get people thinking more and more about insurance. But you've got to look at your policy and know what it says. What does it cover? What doesn't it cover? Again, if you're in a particular area that has risk, you'd be surprised at how many of the common risks associated with hurricanes are actually excluded from standard policies. So for example, flooding, which is a major concern, particularly if you're right on the coast, is not included in most standard insurance policies for businesses. In some areas, wind damage from hurricanes is also excluded from the policies. So your standard policy then covers fire and theft, but does not cover these kinds of natural hazards. So again, you got to spend a little time thinking about what insurance you have and what it does and does not cover, so that you're ready for these kinds of things. To get even more connected to the kind of the ground, things like first aid training. Maybe you take the time to train yourself or some of your employees in first aid and first aid delivery. Again, we talked about supplies and resource buffers already. We talked about plans. Maybe you run some drills. Maybe you do some employee training. Maybe you go out and get that generator, right? So what do you actually need? Maybe you do business continuity planning for each of your units. Water storage. Maybe you have somebody do an assessment of the building you're in. Again, there's a whole bunch of activities that you can do that are concrete, that kind of step you closer to being aware of what your risks are. Some mitigation things, even if you own your building, or you can work with your landlord to do things like storm shutters. Or sometimes when you're building out sites, they elevate the electric a little bit so it's not so close to the ground. You might elevate some of your equipment that's vital. So again, there's a lot of things you can think about in terms of getting ready to avoid risk or danger as much as possible.
So I want to throw you a curveball follow-up question. So you mentioned early in this excellent answer that the importance of being able to understand the failures, those canaries in the coal mine, small issues that could be big, and then also the engagement within your organization. And we hear all the time from people who are, tasked with the emergency preparedness planning within their organizations that, because they're looking at something long term and, something that people think may or may not happen, that they really struggle to, get other people inside their organization to work with them. Have you ever seen this done well, to create an issue log of, potential risks, or to create that kind of cross-departmental relationship, flowing through the emergency preparedness professionals, where the communication stream was like really, really good?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's two kind of ways that this happens. I think in the organizations that do it well. One of the ways that happens is that you get upper level buy-in, right? So you get the ear of somebody in a higher level leadership who can kind of enforce it from the top down, right? Where you can get on board and you can kind of explain to people that are in the managerial level what these concerns are. You can show them information from other businesses. There's stats out there on kind of disaster exposures and how many businesses go under, particularly in the small and medium size when they're affected by these kinds of things. So it may not be the most likely, right? So it may not be the most probable thing, right? So the most likely to happen. But for those organizations that experience these things and aren't ready, it's often catastrophic, meaning that a lot of businesses don't survive if they're not prepared. So I think, again, it's kind of helping them think through not just how likely it is, like what are my individual chances, but what are the consequences if it does turn out to happen here? So I think that's that, and again, upper level leadership. The other thing is to realize that emergency management, emergency planning, business continuity planning is a skill set. There's a specific kind of mentality to the job. And there are people that train, that have degrees, that have kind of put their attention to developing those skills. And a lot of it has to do with relationship building. So there is some substantive kind of knowledge, but I've seen kind of this cult of personality develop around really good business continuity managers because they spend time building relationships with the people in these other offices. You're not dropping in to ask somebody to fill out your business continuity survey and then you leave and you never talk to them again. It's people who actually get engaged in what's going on in these other units and actually care about what their needs and concerns are and can talk to them on a personal level. Those are the people that can develop plans that are most effective, and they develop the relationships that they need to be able to deliver that. So again, I think, thinking about it as a long-term investment rather than a kind of quick down and dirty thing, it's a significant amount of the time that's spent on this is spent on building the relationships necessary to kind of deliver the agenda.
Thanks. So I also want to ask you about on-site employees. How does this apply to businesses who have to keep their employees on site, like say a hospital? And how do
Sure.
how do they balance taking care of their family or personal needs with the needs of the organization or their employer?
Absolutely. So when we talk about employees and coming to work during these kinds of events, it's been studied enough that we actually have some terms for this, right? So we talk about role strain or role conflict and role abandonment. The idea being that the role strain or conflict means that you're being asked to do one thing by one of your roles as a person, and you're being asked to do something else. So that's a good example here, where like I've got a few kids here, and if something happens, as a dad, I want to be there for them, right? I want to be able to take care of it. I've got to take care of my home and my family, and at the same time, I work in this business that's trying to deliver on something, and they're trying to. And I have an alliance or a role as a business person, as someone in an organization to deliver on that. So we talk about that as role strain or role conflict. Um, in Now, the degree to which that turns into a problem for an organization it varies quite a bit, right? So the first thing is it depends on how big the event itself is, right? And we know that people who have damage to their homes that are having problems with their kids in terms of school or in terms of and being at school or injuries, those folks are going to have a real hard time coming to work, right? But organizations have to think about that if they're really concerned and it is really critical. They need to think about that as part of their planning process, right? So again, some of it's conversations with employees. So what is the expectation? Do you expect people to be there the next day? Can your business close for a couple of days and be okay? Are you in a business where you have to be there, and you can't miss for any reason? So first off, just setting up what those expectations are ahead of time is really important, because I think a lot of people assume that they know or assume that their employees know, but have never actually verified that that's true. The second thing is for employees that are particularly critical, it's an organization should be thinking about what they're doing to make sure that that person is ready and able to come to work. So, for example, maybe you hold an event in your business on household level preparedness, right? So it's really important part of your job here that you think about getting your household ready for these kinds of events. And, in some places, they even provide some services directly. So they'll do something like an incentive if you're going to purchase a preparedness kit, or if you do emergency planning for your house, you get some kind of gift, or you get some kind of bonus, or you get something. And again, ways to incentivize people to think through these processes in their personal life so they can be ready to come to their professional life. The other thing is in the event of, you might provide some direct services. So particularly employers that have like feeding facilities, or employees that have larger number of employees might do child care support. So again, providing an environment where that helps the employee meet the needs of that other role, and thinking of that as part of your business planning so that they're able to deliver what you need them to, right? So again, the conflict and the strain comes from the disconnect between employees and employers, and whatever you can do to kind of close that gap gets you that much better, that much closer to the finish line. So I think that's what I would say there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. We've reached the end of my questions, so I'm gonna open it up to anyone who's attending or listening now. You can drop questions into the chat box, and we've got a few minutes left for Joe to answer them. So I have a first question here for you, Joe. How often should a business be testing their testing their hurricane preparedness plan?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the answer is kind of built into one of the other things I talked about earlier, that it really should be a continual process. And I know that's tough. I think at a minimum, what they recommend that each year as the hurricane season starts to ramp up, so just before hurricane season, you should at a minimum review it on an annual basis. But again, I think that the problem with doing it that way is that your take on any kind of issues or changes or problems all at once. So, and I think that for most places, the best bet is to kind of nibble it away at it, make continuous small improvements across time, rather than seeing this as some unique and distinct kind of task that you have to do.
Great. And then one other one, is there a specific type of hurricane preparedness exercise you recommend to companies to run?
Sure. So I think that in terms of specific exercises, I think that I probably wouldn't. So when I think exercise, I think of a kind of running through a tabletop where you know, spitball a problem and try to work through it. I think that what I would start with is just really critically assessing what your real needs are, right? So when you're talking about business continuity planning, it's about prioritization. So everybody thinks that they're the most important employee, or every business process has to be put together. So I think it's stopping to really prioritize and think through, you know, short term, medium term, and long term, where you have to put your attention first. I think just getting on the right page there first, that's the thing that I would do at the beginning, right? It is, you know, to really critically assess what the timeline for business response and recovery looks like. And then it gives you a sense of how urgent it is to do each of these other kinds of tasks. So that's the first thing I would do. And then the second thing, again, I would say is that engagement across the units, right? So getting the conversation going, not just from what some business continuity planner by themselves thinks, but what are the kind of, how does your company think about risk? What have they done? What has actually been going on? What are the kind of most pressing needs or concerns that people have? And you start with those small wins, it can build on itself, and people see value from it. You're likely to be able to continue on doing other kinds of related preparedness activities.
Awesome. We have another question here. In a corporate structure, where do you think that safety and security should be aligned to?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that I've seen it happen in lots of different ways, right? So I've seen high level employees, so high level managers, tasked with this. I think in my mind, that's the best arrangement. Because again, I do think that there's got to be some level of buy-in at upper level management, or else people have a tendency to kind of dismiss it as a problem for tomorrow, because you're busy dealing with all the issues you have every day. So I think in my mind, in the executive kind of level or the upper level managerial level, I think it's good to have someone who's got this on their radar as an important business task. So again, I think for me personally, I think that's where it goes. I've seen people integrated into operations. I've seen people integrated into their risk analysis units. So like in banking, for example, they're worried about risk of, you know, all kinds of different threats. So they lump this kind of business continuity in with, you know, market risks and other kinds of risks. So again, I've seen it done lots of different ways. I think that the most important thing actually is not specifically where you place it. It's the processes you use to implement it, right? So I think that's what I would say.
Awesome. And does your department at the University of Delaware ever work with private companies? And are there resources / relevant research that you can share?
Sure. So we definitely have done this kind of work. So everything ranging from just simple conversations like this to we've done regional kind of assessments of business recovery after events like the Northridge earthquake or other flooding. We have done some small talks directly to individual units. So we've done those kinds of things for sure. We actually have an interesting resource here. It's a library that's completely devoted to disaster and emergency management. Over 120,000 books, articles, documents, plans, report, all kinds of different material. We have a full-time resource collection coordinator here who actually oftentimes will help people get started or help people think through things. And again, I did mention before, it's not us directly, but I think the business continuity professional associations are also a good place to kind of get started. FEMA also has some early resources for that kind of thing, for kind of business continuity, business preparedness and planning at ready.gov. And again, I'd be glad to kind of field questions directly or provide additional guidance on specific issues to the best of my ability. And if I can hopefully connect you to other professionals around the country here who can.
Awesome. And so Joe's contact information is here on the question slide. We're also going to be following up with everyone who registered or attended today. We're going to be sending you tomorrow a recording of this webinar, along with a way that you can get in touch with Joe if you think of any other follow-up questions. And anything that we didn't get to today, we can write up in our blog. So thanks everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Joe. This was a great conversation, and you are very, very knowledgeable.
No problem. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. We're skipping a week on our webinar. We're going to be back on July 12th with Daniela Miller of Macy's. The topic of the webinar is Become an Emergency Preparedness Advocate for Your Organization. And I think that this dovetails really nicely into some of the things that Joe highlighted today. So Daniela has built that kind of cult of personality at Macy's around preparedness, and she helps people organize their own personal preparedness as well as organizational preparedness, so that they, can bounce back in their personal lives faster after a disaster happens. So we're super excited to talk to Daniela, and we will be emailing everyone an invitation to this webinar in about a week, and we hope to see you there. AlertFind is an emergency notification system for business continuity professionals. If you have any questions or you would like to see a demo of it, we would be so pleased to show you one. You can email me, or you can schedule a demo at any time through a form on our website. And again, here's Joe's contact information if you want to get in touch with him for any further questions. And thanks so much for attending. We hope to see you next time.